Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a warm welcome from me on behalf of the Behavioral Innovation Lab of the Policy Innovation Center to this webinar. It's really important because we're going to be discussing a very important topic titled Behavior is Everything. But let me just take a step back and first introduce you briefly to the Policy Innovation Center, our lab, the Behavioral Innovation Lab, and then this webinar series. So the Policy Innovation Center is the first nationalized, institutionalized behavioral initiative in Africa. And we're set up in 2021 to really support new thinking around how policymakers, stakeholders, development practitioners can reflect better about how to make decisions and impact social interventions, and just really ensure that for everything we're doing in everyday life, whether we're supporting public policy or we're trying to design an intervention to increase demand, or we're trying to support opportunities, for example, to address social issues from gender-based violence to issues relating to food security or even insecurity in our country or on our continent, we can reflect on the behavioral barriers that can impact on how interventions are viewed and adopted. So since 2021 that the PIC has been set up, we have been working across 6 sectoral areas to ensure that we're deepening the impact of social interventions in Nigeria. The Behavioral Innovation Lab was set up in 2022, first in response to a need to think deeply about how to harness behavioral insights to counter corruption in Nigeria, and just think about new innovative approaches for addressing issues relating to accountability and transparency. And since 2022, the lab has gone on to support cutting-edge behavioral interventions in health, in agriculture, in gender, in governance, and currently working on a wide range of issues. And this webinar series gives us that opportunity to engage you in conversations that help us to not just better understand the behavioral barriers that impact on everyday problems, but also ensure that we are building capacity and providing an opportunity for learning and deeper reflection about what evidence-informed decision-making should look like, either in the policy or intervention space. So sit back and relax, enjoy this webinar. Hopefully we'll get the conversations going, get very rich engagements, and hope to see you not just in this webinar, but in subsequent webinars. Permit me at this time to take a step back and introduce you to our Behavioral Innovation Lab team. So over to you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to have you join us once again. My name is Akinwunmi Akinola. I am the head of Behavioral Innovation Lab in the Policy Innovation Center, and it's a joy to welcome you to this webinar titled Behavior is Everything. And indeed, you would agree with me that behavior is everything. I have a very fantastic guest in the house, but before I introduce my guest, just by way of setting the context, in our time, we know that innovation and strategy and talent management has taken the center stage. And because of that, you find that behavior usually responds to context. I'm not presumptuous into what we are going to discuss today, but suffice to say that behavior speaks to every aspect of your life, whether it is in your family life or your personal life, whether it is in business or you work in the policy space. You will find this fireside chat very useful and insightful to improve your outcomes and lead a successful life. And on this note, I want to warmly welcome you to Behavior is Everything. Thank you once again for joining. And so my guest today is somebody that we just met some couple of days back, but we've had very virtual interactions in the past 2 to 3 months, and is a world-renowned behavioral scientist whose work has traversed using behavioral science to improve work, whether it's in leadership or in product development, or even as it is, software engineering, and right now in the policy space. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Steve Wendel to this fireside chat. Steve, it's good to
have you. It's an honor to be here. The work that the Policy Innovation Center does is very inspiring, really a leader in the area, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. I mean, on a lighter note, this is your first time in Nigeria. How has it been, our culture? What does it feel like being in Nigeria?
It has been great. I have to say, food is rather spicy.
Ooh. I get that.
Oh, yeah.
I get that. Always when we travel, people say, you guys can be loud. And then they say that your foods are very spicy. So, welcome to the Nigerian, a taste of Nigerian delicacy. And I hope the context will be very warm to you. This is going to be very insightful for a lot of people, and we have a wide range of audience. So our context and our conversation will cut across several sectors. But to set the tone, maybe we should start from the basics. What exactly is behavior, and how does this differ from very usual context that we discuss, like attitude and personality and some of these psychological concepts?
Sure. Yeah, so we think of behavior as the things we do. And the reason that we find it interesting is that it's so often different than the things we say we want to do. Because there's so often a gap between what we express, like, I want to exercise more. I want to work harder. But then I go watch Netflix, or I go read a book, or I go play outside, whatever it might be. And so that's why it's so interesting, is that in order to affect change in our world, our intentions aren't enough. And so as behavioral scientists, we look at that, as it were, the final mile, that final step. What do people actually do?
I'm sure a lot of people will be wondering at the back of their mind, oh, this guy is speaking to me, because many people set goal at the beginning of the year and say, I want to lose so pounds of weight. Yeah. I want to achieve this particular milestone, what you call success, but are unable to. And from what you have seen, they demonstrate intention, but that doesn't necessarily translate to experience. What are those things that stand in the gap of somebody having a wish, maybe setting a goal at the beginning of the year and translating it to a lasting behavior or achieving that goal, for instance, in this case of losing your weight?
Sure. Well, I don't know if I'm speaking to you, but I am speaking to myself. This is a matter, I mean, these are, as behavioral scientists, we are in no way free of these challenges. And the inside joke within our community is we're talking about how we ourselves couldn't exercise, which is true, why we ourselves fail to follow through, right? And so I always think about the we rather than the they, right? Or the. And so what are some of the things that can get in the way? Well, it's myriad, right? Some of them are, like, I use exercise as an example because it's something that personally I've struggled with all my life, right? And so I may have a very strong intention. I may set a goal in the beginning of the year. But do I know where the gym is, right? Simple, stupid fact that I could spend time on any point. But the mere fact that I could do it at any time makes it so much easier to do it later and later and later, right?
That's procrastination.
Yes, it's procrastination, but it's also it's a rational procrastination. Because really, if I exercise today or tomorrow, ain't gonna make a whit of difference. The problem is that's true every single day. And so some of the other things that can get in our way would be, I'm a skinny dude. When I go to the gym, I look at these people who are buff, I'm like, I do not belong here, right? Identity matters. How people see us and how they respond to us in nonverbal ways, that matters. And even more than them responding, my fear of that moment bleeds into the present. And so I don't do it. And on top of that, I'm just lazy, just to be clear.
Interesting. Fantastic. Well, you've talked about social norm, you've talked about goal setting and procrastination, but I just want to interrogate further. Yeah. When we talk about social norms and the expectations that people have of us, is it always negative, especially when you think about wanting to conform to a social expectation? I'll take an instance of the one that you narrated. Isn't it good that there is a social expectation that wants me, even if that social expectation or norm is rooted in science, to say that the less weightier you are, the more healthy you are? I don't know if that is granted, but would that not be a norm that is desirable? Are there positive norms that one should aspire to?
Yeah, of course. And you see them. I mean, I've been here for a few days with the Policy Innovation Center, and of course, I see them in your work every day, right? The norm of hard work, the norm of joking with each other, having a good time, right? The norm of seriousness about the topics that you work on, right? Of gender-based violence, et cetera. That's a wonderful thing. Like many things in behavioral science, we call it a bias, we call it a problem when it's the part we don't like. But just imagine for a moment that we were not affected by other people's expectations. The world would be absolute chaos.
True.
Right? Right?
Boring.
Yeah, it'd be boring. Like the social norms help us act in a way that coordinates with each other all the time. There's a social norm of which side of the road to drive on. You take away that norm, we're in a whole lot of trouble, right? There's a social norm around not beating your kids. That's a great thing.
Interesting. Thank you so much for that. And just trying to establish the essentiality of behavioral science and understanding how behavior happens. Why is this so important? What are there very consequential effects of not mastering your behavior? And how has this played out, whether it's in work or family life, or even in corporate space?
I mean, I can certainly think of some answers, but I'd be much more interested in your thoughts about this. How do you see this? How do you see this playing out in the many projects that you all work on across Nigeria and across the region?
Okay, so this is very interesting because we found behavior as important as determining or deciding the direction of voting of the electorate. We found that very instructive in how people make decisions and even choose life partners. Talk about the cases of gender-based violence. And we've even seen behavior play out in things as important as consumer behavior and how you understand what your client's preferences want, what their personas are, and in shaping how you design in a way that that product is in demand. So we find it very useful across board. And it's something that we don't play with in Policy Innovation Center, often because this, no matter how much of policy you want to make, particularly at a macro level, it's individuals that are going to use this policy at an individual level. So it's very important to have that at the back of our mind. I'd like to ask you, oftentimes one of the behavior, the behavior of kindness that we find very interesting in our setting, and I mean, Nigeria is a very cultural place. I mean, in the Western world, if you are stranded on the road, and having a mechanical problem, you might get into minutes before you get the help in hand. And so, but in our context, we have that culture of wanting to help. But oftentimes, we've also seen this boomerang in a lot of ways. And my question is really about the science of kindness. So oftentimes, we want to help. For instance, take the case of black tax, family members wanting you to support, with livelihoods and all of that. But sometimes if you're not careful, you find that they keep coming back again and again, as though they have their salary in your hands or they have some stakes, stashed up with you. How do you manage your intention to be generous without breeding a culture of dependence?
Sure. So I guess the first answer is, that's a tough one. I'm going to avoid it. So let me talk more generally about the altruism side, because the science of altruism is really fascinating. Like many of the words we use in our daily lives, it seems like a thing. Yeah. Someone's altruistic or not, but it's not. It's actually a mash of lots of different concepts of what's going on. Like we could unpack what you were just talking about and say, okay, so expectation to help your family, right? Is that altruistic, or is that the fear of social sanction when you don't? They're bundled together because it helps the recipient to, in fact, enforce that norm, to call it altruism, right? To call it kindness, when it's not, right? Sometimes. And in other cases, right, economic models say that at an individual level, societal levels being different, at an individual level, well, why would you do such a thing? Why would you give away your resources, your time, et cetera, to somebody else? But yet people do it every day. And not in any self-interested way, in any forced way, but in a true, thoughtful way, out of their hearts. And so you've got side by side in this one concept, the beauty of grace, the beauty of helping another person, with the extortion of somebody who's using that against you, all in the same word. That's cool.
One of the things that we found out also is that a lot of people can, particularly people who are manipulative, can use kindness as a trap. And so one of the things they throw out forward is to be kind with you, but having sinister and mischievous motive at the back of their mind. And so sometimes it's helpful to know how to draw the boundaries and know where to draw the line between somebody too chivalrous, somebody too kind to you, without being able to explain that kind of kindness. But I like what you have said about kindness in itself being pure, in the sense that, but just for the sake of our viewers, would you say that kindness in its purest form should not expect anything in return?
That's a moral judgment.
That's a moral judgment.
Yeah, I would say, as a researcher, it exists and it's beautiful. Now, lots of other things that exist around it that are not that, but is that how we should act? I personally believe it's a good thing.
Interesting. Now, there's a concept called sunk cost fallacy. And for the purpose of our viewers who may not be privy to this, this is explaining the concept of wanting to continue in a direction, even when it is all your attempt in that direction has failed. In other words, you keep going because of the investments that you've sunk in that entire process. And so you don't want to lose. It's also very similar to the concept of loss aversion. So for instance, we find in many of our settings, marriages that are not necessarily working. When I say not necessarily working, it's very abusive, almost leaning towards physical violence. And you find that a lot of people, particularly women, want to keep up in that kind of marriage because, in other words, they say, I want to reap the fruit of my labor, and the fruit of my labor are my children getting educated and succeeding in life. What would you have to say to that? Is sunk cost really a fallacy? Do you think it's a misjudgment that doesn't work? Are there any benefits in just thinking maybe futuristically about staying in that marriage and possibly one day, these children would justify why I stayed?
Sure. So I guess there's a specific answer and a more general one. A specific answer to remove any ambiguity. If anyone's in that situation, get the heck out. The research that I know of, that I'm familiar with, says it doesn't turn around, and the violence gets worse, and the expectation that the person will just roll over and allow it gets worse. Now, that is in stark contrast to what I'm going to say about it generally. So that's one. I never want a statement about sunk cost or any of these issues to seem like I'm saying that people should stay in a domestic violence situation. Okay. More generally, sunk cost is a tricky term, right? And it's tricky in how we use it in everyday life. In economics, right? So you would say, rationally, looking at your future, the only thing that matters is what is your future gain versus your future loss, right? And many of the responses against that would be to say, but yeah, what about loyalty? What about perseverance? What about social reputation? And these are all valuable things, okay? And so when they're not at play, we call it a fallacy, right? Or sorry, when they are at play, we call it a fallacy and say, why are you doing this thing, right? But really, the definition is slippery in that all of those would then count towards some of the future gains, and we just magically make it a fallacy only when all those other things we just mentioned happen to be negative. So it's a difficult concept to work with, precisely because of that reason.
But in factual terms, what you're saying right now is that from science and from what you're saying, likelihood and chances are that remaining in a marriage that is not working, that is abusive, with the expectation that maybe the husband, or the perpetrator will change, usually doesn't come out well.
Yeah. I'm not an expert in gender-based violence. But my understanding of the literature is people will be, I can't even say better off, because sadly there's so many forms of dependency that even leaving the household can leave someone in an economic dependent situation. But to avoid the violence itself, I think there's good reason in the statistics to say that's not the best path. But again, I'm not an expert in this, and I'm very careful not to, certainly not to say for anyone ever to stay in a situation of violence.
Interesting. Okay, fantastic. One of the things that we found out, particularly in Policy Innovation Center, trying to understand people's behavior, electorate's behavior in the build-up of the 2023 national elections, is to see what are the factors that are influencing the intention of people to either sell their votes or not want to vote at all. In other words, we want to measure the determinants of voter apathy or vote selling.
Yep.
And when we got on the streets and we started having conversations with them, present bias came top of mind. In that a lot of them say, I mean, why would I not want to sell my vote? Because despite that it is a criminal behavior, despite that it is punitive, they feel that this is a national cake that is, in quotes, stolen. And the thinking is, once I have this opportunity in 2 years or in 4 years to recover my stolen wealth, maybe through the free distribution and supposed kindness of politicians, why wouldn't I want to maximize that opportunity? And so the question that came is present bias. The concept of present bias is something that is very topical in behavioral science. Everybody wants something that is good now. I don't want it in 2 years' time. Even if you have to reduce the size of what I get, I want what. And there's also a school of thought that I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. Only God knows tomorrow. Is a very in a really very highly religious context like Nigeria, everybody can relate with that. The question is, how do you solve for the problem of present bias, particularly when it comes to creating interventions that might take time for the gains to come?
Yeah.
And I'll give you an instance. In public policy, for instance, there are some policy decisions that, even in economic terms, they say it takes time, they're macroeconomic and all of that. But the masses are complaining. Some of these indices and some of the structural changes that you're making, we're not feeling it. I want food on my table now. I want to pay my children's school fees now. What do you think, how do you think we can intervene in such a way that the present bias is not going to get in the way, knowing that it is also a natural tendency of men?
Yeah, so present bias isn't a problem.
Okay, interesting.
Rather, it's a fundamental trait of our minds. And again, it's only when it leads to things we don't like that we call it a bias. So if you're walking down the street and you're thinking about your job and the things you have to do in a few weeks, and there's a car barreling at you, which do you prioritize? The long-term benefit of your job and doing your work, or getting out of the way of that car? Our minds are naturally wired to the present, and that keeps us alive, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the first place I always start is, what's good about this? Why is it that we would do something that seems so foolish, right? And so, given that present bias is a thoughtful response of our minds to the environment, rather than this horrible thing we need to stop, I say, nah, okay, probably not going to change the human brain that deeply. Let's change the situation, right? Let's try something else. Let's see, what is the benefit now to not selling your vote? What's the benefit now to being seen as an upstanding citizen? What's the benefit now to going on the media and getting an interview of, yeah, I stood firm? How can you fight fire with fire rather than ask people to tighten their belt, don't worry about the present and think only about the future, right? I say, focus on the present, darn right.
I think there's just also a lot about managing citizens' expectations with regards to that.
Yeah.
For instance, when you find that, and knowing from science that the outcome of this policy or this intervention is going to, the gains are going to come in 2-3 years.
Right.
Your citizens want immediate gain. Fundamentally, number one, how do you communicate this to them? And that's about policy communication and the intersect of this with behavioral science. That you need, firstly, to speak in the language of the people and the language that the people can understand. That's where you can get their buy-in. And once you get their buy-in, it's easier for you to now begin to sell temporal initiatives. In Nigeria, they call them palliatives and all manner of names. But what is important is that understanding the expectation of immediacy from citizens calls and demands that government also puts that in priority consideration in trying to evolve and formulate policies and managing expectations. I think that is also always very, very useful.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Akin.
Thank you so much. I know that you have an history, institutional experience working around employee engagement. And globally, employee engagement is, I mean, according to Gallup poll, is very abysmal at 21%. What that means is that 4 in 4 workers are not invested in their work. There is no commitment, there is no voluntary commitment, and there's no real engagement with their work, even if they are physical presence. And by this, we're not talking about just attendance and being and showing off as though you're working on a laptop. The question is, what are the mechanisms, or from your experience, how can behavioral science help to improve employee engagement?
Yeah. So that would be the most recent Gallup study on employee engagement, right? Globally?
Yes.
Sure. So the 21% is interesting, in part because, well, behavioral science doesn't have an answer that we all look for, which is, what's the thing I can do that will magically make my people work harder and love my company? Ain't none, don't exist. Rather, what behavioral science really is a process. It's not a bag of tricks, it's not a magic wand. And in that 21%, and in the 79 on the other side, is a tremendous diversity of situations. We know, for example, that your manager is the most important factor in your overall happiness at work, right? And so, in some cases, that's gonna be what's going on. You got a manager who's a jerk, you're probably not gonna be that engaged, right? But in other cases, it's, do I have the tools for my job? Do I have respect? And if you dig into the Gallup study, they ask those questions, right? About your manager, about the tools at work. But they also, one of the key lessons of behavioral science is precision in your thinking. The Gallup study includes, for example, a question about, do you have a best friend at work? I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily care if my employees have a best friend at work. I'm happy, some of my friends, some of my employees do, and I'm very happy for it. But I'm not sure about the causal link between that and engagement at work, right? And so there's a muddle of things in the Gallup measure, which is well respected and very useful, but we've got to think about what it really means. And so I would dig into a particular context and say, okay, particular company, let's see what's going on with your people. What's the context? Do they have the tools? What are the managers like? Let's dig in here with an understanding that that may or may not apply to another company. And so it's an acceptance of the limitations of our findings, right? Because these things don't magically port, they don't generalize. We look for the structure of accountability, the structure of applicability. Under what circumstances can a particular study help in a different location? But there's no general answers.
Interesting, but I like the fact that you talked about the working conditions as some of the things and the environments that shapes whether an employee will be engaged or not. I think there are other couple of things, like whether you were ab initio even interested in that line, you know, what is called the Ikigai now, the nexus between your passion, your hobby, and what is in demand, or the necessary skills that you need to put to work. And I think that is also very instructive. One of the things I've seen work around here in the Nigerian setting, because you can't keep employee retention based on salary. Well, yes, salary is a very important factor, but many times it's the perks of work and the working conditions and whether that employee feels fulfilled that really determines the longevity and the level of engagement of employees at work. One of the things, and I will share a story of a friend who, knowing that as a startup organization, he couldn't compete on salary, just estimated. And each time that he stopped, take a break, right? A lunch break to go and find somewhere to eat, and they return back. He evaluated what that meant for his business, because many times when they come back, they are tired. Their productivity has waned significantly. And he just said, okay, what is it going to cost me to not necessarily increase their salary, but to put food on their table at a very cost-effective amount? every day. And instead of increasing the salary, right, by that same estimate, he chose to provide free lunch in the office. And to a large extent, many of them, even in their exit interview, said that's one of the reasons why they stayed. So little things like that. I think what is instructive to say here is that little tweaks and changing what you call the context architecture, working conditions in this kind of case, in the organizational environment can significantly shape the behavioral outcomes that you get from your employee.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Steve. I would kick off the segment with the performance management questions.
Sure.
For many of us who work in organizations, the COVID-19 pandemic was a disruptor in a lot of ways, particularly how we work. And one of the things that we have found is the evolution of hybrid work, right? Remote and hybrid.
Yep.
And the thinking is because in the wake of COVID-19, the necessity was there for people to work remotely, but the question about accountability for the productivity of the worker when the person is working independently or remotely also has taken the front burner in terms of the questions that we need to answer. And to that extent, a lot of employers are asking, how do I ensure that the productivity of my staff is guaranteed if I choose to take the path of remote work? Because it is cost effective, it is innovative, it is fantastic in a lot of ways. But we also need to be able to solve for emerging problems like, micromanagement that could come, or the bug of compliance fatigue, clocking in and clocking out. But does that really translate to productivity at work? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's something that's really important for me. I mean, I work remotely. Everybody in my company works remotely, and we really value that type of freedom. And I think, like with many issues in our behavior, context is king. So in the U.S., the solution has been force people back to the office. At the start, right? In other contexts, we see the research evidence is much more mixed, right? And the ways that we help people who are working remotely, by and large, there's studies of how you help people perform better overall, how you help them stay in a company overall, and there hasn't seemed to be much specifically about helping in remote work. But there are some lessons we can draw. So, for example, one of the techniques that has been used is recognition, right? Recognizing the good work that people do. And we all should do that, right? We should all, both our peers and members of our teams, we should do that, right?
Yes.
But how that recognition happens depends very much on context and what it does. So there was a study, Bangladesh, where they gave public recognition to one group of people and private to another. The public group said, "Thank you, wonderful," and then they were more likely to leave their jobs. Oops. Don't think that's what they were going for. But now there was another study in Zambia, if I recall correctly, that had the opposite, right? It helped boost performance and didn't cause turnover, right? Probably in the context of Bangladesh, it was because that was a tool that allowed somebody to get another job, which, by the way, is a good thing. And if that's what's keeping them back, give everyone recognition, right? So other studies look at, well, so of course, the quality of your manager, self-monitoring is a key technique,
Very
right?
important.
So, because we all know that your computer can watch you while you're doing your work, and that's creepy and nobody likes it, right? But we can encourage people to form the habit of setting goals and tracking their own time, not for others, but to see, what did I accomplish? What can I be proud of today? How do I make it about myself, my success, my growth, not this manager is trying to tell me what to do, right? And so those are techniques that work, but I would also say behavioral science should always be humble. These nudges, these small changes, they're important, but what about electricity? What about internet access? One of the challenges in remote work by context, right, is in some contexts, you're asking people to work remotely when they don't have a generator. And the power goes out. It's not their fault. They're not more productive, and they're probably frustrated about it, especially if they were told to do it, right? or they have a noisy environment, et cetera. I don't know of any randomized control trial or proper study on the effect of having no power and no internet access versus getting a certificate that says that you're doing a great job. But as a researcher, I'm pretty sure the first one's more important, right?
I think that is very helpful. One of the things we have also seen in behavioral science is that human beings overestimate their self-control, right?
Oh, yeah.
In this case right now, discipline. So what you find is that depending on the maturity level of your organization and the culture of that organization, if you take that route of remote work without having built that very strong culture, chances are that you would have a lot of people not be able to account for their productivity when they work independently.
Exactly.
And so I think the context varies, and I think the maturity phase of the organization also, and the culture of the organization also have a role to play in this. But what is important is that people don't like to be micromanaged. In other words, there's what you call a performance anxiety, which means that if you are looking every second, if you are looking at my laptop, seeing what I'm doing and trying to see whether I'm frittering away my time or I'm doing what I'm expected to do, I get that pressure, and that pressure makes me not optimal in my performance, right? So what is supposed to be good has an unintended consequence that is counterproductive in the outcome. So what is important is that you are able to build a culture of voluntary performance. And that has worked excellently in PIC. I don't think we do micromanage people. I think that one of the things that we have built as a culture is to get everybody into that mental frame and model that we drive performance and you determine the pace of your performance. And I think that has worked effectively for us as an organization. I think it's a good place to clap.
Yeah. Well said, and a great example.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask some public policy questions. I know that you have a forte in public policy. And my first question with regards to that is, what are some low-cost, high-impact behavioral interventions that you've seen effective and working in several organizations?
Sure. And there are actually quite a few. Now, as a behavioral scientist, they are so well established and so well replicated around the world that it's actually kind of embarrassing in my community to talk about them because they're not new. But the point is they work, right? So some of them, social appeals on tax compliance. It actually works. When you tell people that other folks are paying their taxes, assuming it's true, you never lie to folks, right? Then that boosts the remainings who are laggards, right? Automatic savings programs, defaults, for example, on, well, there's some debate on organ donations, but let's just say defaults in savings programs, right? Asking a large group of people and asking if they want to save, and then they say yes, and so you set the default that they're going to save at their workplace or they're going to save for the pension scheme in the government, et cetera. That's really powerful, right? Like when you just take people at their word and you help do it for them and you default them in, that's tremendously powerful.
Yep.
Simple, stupid stuff like sending SMS or WhatsApp reminders, again and again, yeah, that works. You know, it's not a huge effect. You know, you can get a 3%, 5%, something like that bump, but for the cost of pennies, I'll take it. And so we see studies in Afghanistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Zambia, in Uruguay, all around the world, we have these studies. Again, they're so well established, they're kind of embarrassing that we just don't talk about as a community. Like, oh, you're talking about that again.
Very interesting. And just to lay on what you said about the concept of social benchmarking, which means that it's, in a layman's term, it's social comparison. If your neighbor is doing well in terms of energy conservation, right, that means that reduced energy consumption. You let the counterparts know that the average consumption in this area is at so. And that way, especially if you are above that consumption level, there's a subtle pressure on you to want to, even if my peers are doing lesser than this, it means that there's something I can do, I can achieve this, exactly. Right? So it's competitive in a way. But what one thing we have also found out is that this is true, particularly if the data promote what you want to promote. In other words, if the news is not good, don't sell it for social comparison. For instance, sending a message to say that the voter turnout in your neighborhood is 5%. I don't know how that is going to help you. Right?
It will probably
so
make
it could
things
have
worse. Yeah, it'll make things worse. That 5% is going to say, what the heck am I doing? There's no point.
You would rather
Right?
just
I'm not
rationalize and say,
Yeah.
oh, everybody's not going, so let me just stay at home.
Yeah, right.
Interesting. And these are some of the nuances when we say that behavioral science is context dependent.
Yes,
And that's
exactly.
that concept of context architecture is always very, very important. One of the things that we found out also, the interventions that we've seen work in Policy Innovation Center and some of the work we've done. I've talked about the vote selling our attempts or our intervention at addressing the problem of vote selling and voter apathy in the build-up to 2023 election. So I started off that story around people giving the present bias as the reason why they want to collect money and sell their votes, or not even wanting to vote at all. Because there's distrust for government and they feel like they've been disappointed. So if this money comes, it's free money, let me use it. But one of the things we have done is to do what you call commitment device. And there are many types of them. There's soft commitment, there's hard commitment. In this case, what we got them to do is to say, you know what, guys, in this community, can we arrange and have a consensus on what our community priorities are? And let these community priorities in terms of needs guide who we decide to vote for, right? And we are not mentioning names, we are not promoting, we are non-partisan, but anybody that shares a vision that resonates with your community and you are empowered to make an informed and collective action and decision on voting based on those priorities, those values, and just empowering the community through a participatory process like that. We saw that it changed a lot of things.
Yeah.
Also, letting them realize the future implication of selling their votes, helps them to reduce their present bias. And many of them actually changed their intention to sell votes to not wanting to sell votes. So that's really a typical example.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, if I can just riff on that a bit, right? So you're not asking people, sacrifice, do what's right. You should do what's right, but do what's right. Rather, you're taking fire with fire. You're saying, okay, really, you got a choice here. You sell your vote, and you're effectively saying you're not part of this community.
Yeah.
You're not part of this group that cares about this. Versus, you strengthen your community identity. You strengthen your connection to this group of people you care about.
Yeah.
That's both immediate right now, right? That's lovely.
Interesting. So in terms of how behavioral science can particularly help policy makers or decision makers in the policy space, how do you think behavioral science ties or can improve outcomes looking at the entire policy cycle?
How much time you got?
You've got 3 minutes.
Oh, okay, that's gonna be hard. There are so many different ways.
I can give you 5.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I hope I don't need that much. So there's so many different ways. Let me just give a high level view, right? The most obvious ways are use behavioral science evidence on how people respond, like exactly what you're talking about, right? On community identity versus this. Yes. Build that into the policy, for example, to support community forums before the election, right? That's job number 1. Use the evidence that's out there, evidence-based policy. Job number 2, as you're rolling out a program, behavioral science is really good at communications to help with adoption, right? So not necessarily in the voting context, but let's say in a HPV vaccine context.
Yes.
Lots and lots of studies and evidence on how to help increase adoption of a vaccine, right? Job number 3 is to then monitor and evaluate, to study what happens in the field, to then close that loop, and to use that in evidence-based policy in the future. So to monitor and evaluate, to learn rigorously, and then use it. But that's just the start. There's an area fascinating called, sorry, I love this stuff. There's a fascinating area called behavioral public administration. Yes. Which is all about once a bureaucracy is supposed to do something, after the policy is initiated, like let's have, the government decides to have one-stop shop for women who can meet away from men and talk about domestic violence issues.
Safe spaces.
Awesome, safe spaces, great idea. Except, of course, if the workers there aren't sensitive and they re-victimize people.
Yeah.
And so there's wonderful research in behavioral public administration on how to improve the functioning of bureaucracy. There's, of course, great research on how we make decisions and how we can use those and how we can use those insights into how policymakers themselves react. But in learning particularly from the work that you all are doing, right? I was thinking about just the holistic view that you have about the policymaking process.
Yeah.
And I came with this metaphor. We'll see if it works, right? So we often focus on what's discussed around the table. What are the topics? And we want to make sure that evidence-based policy is there.
Yeah.
But what you all are doing is cool because you're not asking just what's being discussed. You're asking who's at the table. How can behavioral science be used for advocacy and for empowerment so that other people are in that decision-making role?
Yeah.
Awesome. And you're also asking again and again, what's being passed under the table, right? What's happening in corruption? What is warping this process and making the thoughtful voices of everyday citizens lost? So really awesome stuff that you're doing. And I think overall, there's so many opportunities to use this. Okay, hopefully that wasn't 5 minutes. God, I can go on for this so long.
Okay, I want one final question before I switch to my colleague Femi to take questions. And if you have questions, this is prepping you to just write your questions. We'll come back to you. One of the things that we found very intractable, so to speak, in this context is the people that benefit from the bureaucracies. So when you want to simplify bureaucracy, well, when bureaucracies are sometimes very good for internal control, checks and balances and all of that, but many times you find that because people feed off the system, and in specific terms right now, leaning towards corruption, right? That becomes a social problem because it becomes normalized. It becomes, but yes, if you digitize the system, auto payments and all of that, we know that it makes behavior easy for your citizens. I don't need to go and queue for 3-4 hours for me to renew my driver license. I don't need to do some of these things that cost us a fortune of time. But you know that a lot of people benefit from systems that are not digitized. How do you resolve that? Because I also know that you're a political economist, your PhD is in that regard. How do you resolve very funny, intractable systems like that a lot of people behaviorally benefit from?
Sure. So I'll make it brief and put the focus where it should be.
Yeah.
So yes, I've studied this. There is theories about this, but in the end, it's the evidence that matters. And so I've done some studies in corruption. But you all have done a lot more. So I would look to your work, especially like when working in Nigeria, your work in Nigeria to fight corruption, to change that norm, to provide other incentives to, again, not tell people to tighten their belt and just do the right thing, but rather how can you replace that with other incentives? And so I'd look to your considerable body of work in this area.
Interesting. Interesting. We've done a lot of work, and part of the work that we've done, we've institutionalized that through a learning management system that you can access. If you go to binigeria.com, you'll be able to access that entire body of work, talking about the intersect of behavioral science and how you can apply it to solve for the problem of corruption within the African space. I'm going to flip to the audience now. If there are questions, I'd like them to come in. I have a few questions here. The first one says, I have been searching for tested answers. That is, strategies to this question, especially from a BI perspective. And the question is, how do we influence people to complete a form or a poll or an online survey? Nudges in the form of timely reminders and incentives to the target groups are common responses I get. However, I would appreciate practical case studies that drove desired outcomes in terms of numbers of voices that intends to be captured. That's like increasing completion of forms and some of the administrative processes.
Will, there's some simple answers and some hard answers. Simple answer, make it shorter. Yeah, in those cases. There's a few exceptions, but I'll leave those vague. Make it shorter, make it easier, make it clearer, right? And make it valuable. not to you as the surveyor, but to them. What do they, so there are various studies, for example, in interactivity, as you're getting responses as you go along. So it's not just this black hole of data.
Boring
Data.
interface.
Data. Oh, they tell me they're going to send me a report in 6 months. Data.
Which is not always
Data.
true.
Yeah, I know, and it's not even true. So don't lie to people,
Yeah.
right? Make it shorter, make it easier, and make it actually interesting and useful for you.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
that said, I'm sure there's also a real body of literature on the exact placement of the items, and I don't know it, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's actually a lot to say with regards to that. We've also found that if you signal people as to how short and the brevity of that question, that poll, I think it encourages a lot of uptake. And we've seen that play out in a lot of, make it attractive, make it brief, like you said, but much more importantly, let people know, provide that transition, let people know that it takes just 1 minute or 2 minutes for you to talk, and don't lie about that, actually.
Yeah, don't lie.
And don't lie about that. I've got other questions here, and I'm going to read. The second question says, how does emotion and cognitive biases affect decision making?
Sure.
And if you can give examples of that.
Sure, and was that competitive biases?
It could be any bias, right?
Okay,
it
sure.
could be any of the cognitive bias. It could be availability bias. It could be anything.
Sure. Well, emotions are an essential part of who we are,
Yeah.
right? Our anger, our fear, etc. They, of course, taint our judgments. But taint is even the wrong word. They affect them, they inform them. In fact, it's just fascinating work on how our bodies signal us to an intuitive response through our emotions. Really cool stuff, right? Where, for example, you've recognized a pattern of, okay, you're walking down a street, you don't quite hear something, but some part of your brain recognizes this is a dangerous situation, and you start to feel fear, right? And it's not a conscious, rational decision. You're just like, I need to get out of here.
Yeah.
That's lovely. It's the interworking between your intuition, which is often expressed through emotion, to your conscious mind.
Yeah.
It's awesome,
Very useful.
right?
Very useful.
And in other cases, when it seems to get in our way, like road rage, gets in the way of us just accepting that roads are crowded and people do stupid things, etc., right? Then we call it a bias, then we call it a problem.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how can we get knowledge of self? How can we manage those for the good and to weed out the ones that are detrimental to us? But it's not getting rid of emotion.
Yes.
It is essential.
Yeah. And it's actually very constructive because it helps you to prevent an imminent danger, actually.
Yeah, indeed.
Talking about biases, I would give example of availability bias and how that's even it's very influential or it's very useful in marketing. So you find that despite how popular some brands are, I don't want to mention names right now, they still go on recurrent advertisements again and again. And you get to ask the question, why? You are doing so much volume in sales already.
Yeah.
What is all this? Is this intimidation for the smaller brand? Is it is it a buy-over plan or something? But you find that because the human judgment and decision-making arranges things, what you call recall bias, in terms of the most recent information that you have. So if I want to make a choice on what beverage product to buy right now, my brain is going to rearrange in such a way that the one that I listened to or heard about the most recently is what is going to be top of mind for me. And so what they are doing with that advertisement is to ensure that they have what you call your mind share, right? And the way it translates to better sales for them is what you call availability bias, because that is what is readily available to you. Perhaps that's the reason why you have some very good friends, but they've not called in recent time, and you never remember them when opportunity comes knocking. All right, so that's a typical example of availability bias. I'm going to rush through two other questions that came in right now, because I'm mindful of time. First question says, to what extent can we uphold the notion that behavior is everything when justifiable factors constrain individuals from acting on their intentions?
Oh, that is great. That's a great question, whoever that was. So how can we say behavior is everything when there are structural constraints?
Yes, correct.
I would change the first phrase. I wouldn't say behavior per se is everything. I would say behavioral change is everything.
Yes.
And that's a very important difference in that in our daily lives, right, I may not have access to particular financial resources or particular training programs that can empower me and help me do better, right? That's structural. That's not my fault. But systems change through people's behavior. Even when the problem in the system is structural, technological, policy changes when policymakers change policy. It's people who change. It's people who remove structural barriers. It's people who remove technological barriers. So I would say behavior change is everything.
Okay, fantastic. Next one says, what role does cues, triggers, and rewards play in shaping work habits?
Oh, absolutely essential. And we can talk a long time about that one. Yeah. So a large portion of our daily behavior is habitual. And I mean habitual in the cognitive sense of it is triggered by a cue in the environment and we just do the routine, right? So when I log in the morning, right, I don't remember my password. I don't even remember which applications I need to load. I just do it because I'm thinking about what I need to do. I'm not actually working through, oh, how did you spell Gmail again? How do you use a mouse? All of those are habits, and they're invisible to us. Except, of course, when they go awry. Except, of course, when those cues make us do something that's not appropriate to the context. And so, absolutely fundamental, and it's usually like this. It's something we rely on, and we don't notice until it's not there. Furniture.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wendel, with your experience on savings and investment, what is your suggestion to young people who are interested in get-rich-quick schemes? Very interesting question. A very timely one for that matter in Nigeria.
I would advocate skepticism. So, I mean, that one's easy. So I just don't. But some of the best work on savings looks at how we can make it not an issue of self-control. Instead, make it automatic. Make the decision once and lock it in. So for example, setting up an automatic bank transfer, or even better, working with your employer to automatically put that money into a savings account so you don't have to do anything, right? Or every time you get a raise, take half of it and put that to savings. Your standard of living is still better than it was before, right? But that is how you can get ahead. Get rich quick schemes?
Ponzi schemes. You just signal danger as a cue. Okay, what are the common, most effective ways to communicate information to change behavior? That's talking about how do you frame
absolutely
that change behavior.
I always like to end on a disappointing answer.
Which is?
I have no idea. And no one does. Again, behavioral science is a method. It is not a bag of tricks. There is no right way to communicate. Instead, we have to look at the context. Context is king. What are people struggling with? Why? Is it because of lack of trust? In which case, yes, we have a compendium of things that can help with trust. The first and foremost being, be trustworthy, right? Is it a problem of attention? Okay, we have a set of things that can help with that. Is it a problem of cues or habits? We have a set of things that can do that. But until we know the situation, the people involved, their lives, their histories, right? Not in great detail, but until we know structurally what's going on, the honest answer should always be, I don't know.
Interesting. And one of the things we find interesting, because you talked about behavioral science being a method, is sometimes you need to find out why. You challenge your assumptions.
Always.
And then now use those things you find out to design the communications and frame them. And I think that is always very instructive. We have a 5-step process we go through in Behavioral Innovation Lab to be able to do that.
Are we saying that the obvious answer is to talk to the BIO?
Interesting.
It seems like that's where we've ended up.
You can say that again, but we still agree with the fact that, I mean,
it's a process.
It's a process.
Right? You got to go through the process. You have to understand why.
Process. I've been very fascinated about understanding human behavior. Over the years, I have come to understand that behaviors are shaped by 2 broad factors, social structure / system, and individual actions, that is social norms and individual traits, structural norms and individual agency, or simply put, structure and agency. To what extent, this is the question, to what extent can we control these factors? And are there factors to consider when predicting behavior? Can we predict behavior with up to 100% accuracy? If not, are we then looking for answers that don't exist?
Oh, so let me say the nice
question.
before the not nice.
Yeah.
So that's a really nice framing.
Yeah.
I like that, structural and social versus the individual. I think that captures really well these kind of forces in our daily lives, and also how there's an interplay between them, right?
Yes.
That our behavior is affecting that structure in the social side, and the social norms. And that, of course, affects us, right?
Yes.
Now, can we predict behavior 100%? No, and thank you. That would be really creepy.
Yeah.
Right? But that does not mean we have no answers. That does not mean what are we doing? Rather, our goal should never be to control someone else's life. Our goal should be to help on the margins where we can and where it's in someone's desire and interest.
Interesting.
And so I reject the second premise, though I loved the first framing.
Yeah. This question is around beating traffic. And this person says, Nigerians have a habit of beating traffic, even with the law enforcers present. How do we change the behavior of the drivers?
Well, I'd want to do some user research. I'd want to better understand. This is my first time to Nigeria, and so I can't have answers. But I'd want to study. I want to see really what's going on in the structure of the roads that allows that, right? So one thing I've seen is, of course, driving on the sidewalk. And so I'd want to look at the structure of the sidewalks and how that affects. I want to talk to the drivers and see, is it a matter of pride, for example? Yeah, I can do this. I'm proud of it. That's much harder to address than, I'm just in a rush, I'm trying to do this, right? So where people are coming from, listening to their stories and their backgrounds really matters. But first time in Nigeria, I'm going to not give a magic answer here.
Well, I am Nigeria, and I can tell you that you would have to investigate the context in which these behaviors happen.
There we go.
To be able to prescribe. Historically, we've seen a lot of context play out here. What's the behavior of the law enforcer? What exactly is the enforcement strategy? Right? There's a concept around deterrence. There are just a lot of things to consider. For instance, is the fine, sufficient to deter or to constrain the behavior of the driver? And these are some of very, very interesting things that we've worked on. You could check some of these things out. We have policy briefs around corruption and the behavior around corruption on our website. And if you go through the learning management systems, you understand these things also in greater detail. As I close, I would like you to keep this at the top of mind, the learning management system. Indeed, if you have taken the LMS course, you would attest to how simplistic and how insightful that course is. And of course, you get the certificate after having completed the program. As I close, I want you to understand that this webinar is not a one-off. We are going to have several other sessions. As a matter of fact, it's expected to be a monthly webinar. This is the second of the series, and we are going to unveil and announce the dates for the subsequent version. But we really want to thank you for participating in this webinar, and we believe that we've been able to glean valuable, meaningful insights that applies to your work, to your personal life, to family, to business, and even to your policy space. This webinar is brought to you by the Behaviour Insights Network of the Behavioral Innovation Lab or Policy Innovation Center. And it's a joy to have you join us once again this afternoon. Thank you so much, my guest, Dr. Steve Wendel, for joining us. Do join us again for an awesome experience next time. Have a fantastic day.